This episode of the Agora Podcast's Into the Void subseries with Dr. Brian SOVRYN was originally recorded on April 19th, 2025. It is presented here in its entirety for the SOVRYN audience to enjoy. Be excellent to each other.
Welcome back to Agora Podcast. It's Penguin here, and we're back with, you guessed it, another exciting episode of Into the Void with Dr. Brian SOVRYN. What's up, Brian? In a sec.
Hey, boys. I heard the show went fashy, so I showed up to try and set things straight here.
No. All the Trump talk.
No fashy or Nazi punks, fuck off. But and we'll be recording this podcast until we get stuffed in the van and put in a dungeon in El Salvador. So.
If there's not duct tape around my wrist by the end of this, we did something wrong.
What's up, boys? We're back for another one.
Yeah, you're sounding great, Zach, on your phone. I don't know if how this is going to come out in post, but you're loud. I'll do that.
Okay, good. I'll stand back a little then. I got so used to
idea.
I had my microphone etiquette down perfect, but now I don't know where to sit with a phone. So I'll figure it out as we go.
Oh, I can tell is the little circle behind our circles gets bigger and smaller. I'm just trying to judge the amplification of that. This is the least professional audio engineering job you can possibly do.
Well, I mean, phone microphones are really sensitive, that's the way the NSA has programmed them. They want to make sure they can hear you from a really far distance. So
yeah.
It works out in our favor. It's all right.
Well, we gotta get the NSA in and on it too, so
totally. I mean, we can't talk fascism without talking about the NSA. Let's go.
Perfect. So yeah, today we're talking about the origins of fascism and fascism in the U.S. We had a list of topics, and we put it out to the audience, and that was the one I got the most positive response. So we can go for that. I know my thoughts on this, but Brian, I'm going to toss this one to you. Where do you think the origins of fascism come from?
Oh boy. Well, I was also expecting it to more be, fascism in the U.S. But, I mean, I guess an argument could be made that it did start here. Well, a part of me wants to start off with, I think a definition, because there's a big part of me that really just wants to say, Americans really don't understand what fascism, Americans haven't experienced fascism, not in the sense that Europe has. And I say that with a small degree of confidence. And I say a small degree because it's kind of secondhand. From European friends who often make a similar statement, a similar claim. But I do think, the point that I would make first off, and again, I'd like to get into a definition, but the point I would make outright is that America, at the very least, has supported fascism for pretty much 100 years at this point, or about 100 years, depending upon when do we say that fascism actually, started. But I think that support came out of a lack of understanding of what it actually was, by not being, no pun intended, boots on the ground in Europe proper, particularly Italy and Germany. But do we have a definition we want to run off? Do either of you guys have one?
Well, first of all, speaking of definitions, I think I kind of had a misunderstanding earlier too. So, we were saying the origins of fascism in the U.S. We're not really. Correct me if I'm wrong, Sec, but you're not saying the origins of fascism, relegated to a U.S. context, but actually, which would be kind of weird because we're already saying, the U.S. hasn't truly experienced fascism proper, at least at home.
I disagree with that statement, actually.
But it's arguably, I should definitely, with a heavy caveat, arguably. But that I think you're talking about a premise that you've long had, like you've shared with me since before you started the podcast. This is probably the longest running thing that we probably haven't touched very much on, that we had discussed before the before starting the pod. But
yeah, I think fascism originates in the U.S. and it was added upon in like 1800s Prussia, but we can go. I think Brian's right. We should define fascism, which is actually kind of hard to do. It's almost easier to name some characteristics that would fit in that category. I think several definitions of fascism include the merger of state and corporate power, which is sort of that's sort of vague. Mussolini himself, and I think also Giovanni Gentile, described fascism as the merger of state, the individual identity with state. You might say it's the political economy that sort of organizes social and economic life to benefit the nation state as a whole. Does anyone disagree with any of those definitions?
No, I can't really argue with that.
Okay.
I think I can get behind that. Yeah. So are we starting with Andrew Jackson or no? No.
Yeah, I would start with Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There you go.
And George Washington, actually. All right. So here's my spiel on this. Okay. So it's almost easier to work backwards. So you have, Mussolini's style, and fascism differed greatly depending on, which country it was in. It was very different in Nazi Germany versus, Franco Spain versus Mussolini's Italy, et cetera, et cetera. But there was definitely a lot of overlap. And fascism proper, as we know it in the 20th century, in the early 19-teens and 1920s, was sort of a rejection of Bolshevism and liberal capitalism. So it was like, you hear the communists say that the fascists were capitalists, and you hear the capitalists say that the fascists were socialist, and I think neither one is really true. It's truly kind of a third position.
100%.
So I would completely agree that it's a third position. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's something sort of unique. But it has there was a lot of things that overlapped in a lot of those countries. And that was, like I said, organizing the social and economic society to benefit the nation state. So it was sort of a class collaborationist project in the sense that there can be no exploitation of the workers by the capitalist class if we're all on the same page and regimented to benefit the nation state, right? So that's fascism, with a capital F in the 20th century. But you can see a lot of overlap, or what you might call like proto-fascism, moving backwards here in what's called Bismarckian socialism. So when Bismarck took control of Prussia, there was a lot of things that had never been, a lot of programs and a regimentation of society, sort of a martial society. They wanted all the population to serve the nation state of the Prussian state. Strong militarism, widespread welfare, environmental systems. The idea of a state owning property. What else? Lots of social services, all these sorts of things. These are all part of what I would call the political economy of fascism. I would also say that the progressive era, I think FDR is the closest thing that we had. Oh, I'm sorry. I missed a strong executive, very strong executive branch of government in all of the fascist countries. I missed that part earlier. I think FDR fits this description. I think much of the progressive era fits this description. Sort of a cartelization of society, moving society and economic activities to benefit the nation state, militarism, all these sorts of things. So I think FDR and a lot of the what I would call capital P progressives fit this description. They also said so at the time. They praised Mussolini in the New Republic. Mussolini even said, "What is fascism? Well, it's your New Deal." There's a lot of parallels there. And then we move back to Bismarckian socialism, which I said. And then you go back to like Teddy Roosevelt and his idea of like new nationalism. And he was, again, like a militarist, an expansionist. And again, with all the like national parks and all the seizing of like property around the country by the government, this is completely in line with fascism. Even though I like the national parks, so it'd be like the one thing I like about the state, really. And then just this is actually the point where I think the right consumed the left in America was what you call like the bull moose. Rothbard called the progressive area a right-wing plot. So you get the Teddy Roosevelt types, and they sort of consumed what was left of the Democratic Party at that time. Anybody that was any kind of individualist was purged from the Democratic Party. Moving backwards, I'll go all the way back to Hamilton, and then I'll wrap this up so it's not so long of a rant. But Hamilton, his whole thing was he wanted all the clauses in the Constitution, the general welfare clause to provide for the general welfare of the United States. That was him. To regulate commerce, that was him. He spoke out explicitly that these were to things like the general welfare and to regulate commerce was to make sure all the people of the nation state would be what would you call it? Involved, have an incentive to be involved in the nation state, to merge themselves with the nation state. He also said we should favor big American big business, so that they would have a vested interest in working towards the goals of the nation state. He was explicitly expansionist. He wanted a strong executive. Washington is an example of that. He had a sort of a fanatic cult that followed him, called the Society of the Cincinnati, who wanted to essentially make him king or have a very strong executive branch, which is what we have today, which is what we're seeing today. So I would say the only time that this was, I guess you could call proto-fascism, but the only time that the U.S. was not fascist was between the time of the end of the American War for Independence and the drafting of the Constitution. And then from that point forward, we've been basically an imperial fascist country. And I would say World War II was not a war against fascism, but it was something along the lines of international fascism versus autarkic fascism, something similar to like Trotsky and Stalin, where Stalin wanted socialism in one country and Trotsky wanted a world revolution. I think that the fascists in the U.S., they were more internationalist in their fascism, whereas sort of Germany and Franco and also Imperial Japan at this time were more autarkic. They wanted everything done within their own country. And that was really what the war was about, mostly, because they were, cutting off world trade for the U.S., and that was a threat to business in the U.S. So that's where I'm at with that. What does anybody think about that?
Yeah, I think that's pretty interesting. I mean, in my own mind, now I never thought about Otto von Bismarck being a start of that, but so what, he died like 1890, and so he would have been right there. So what I was going to get at is, I always felt like that fascism was an outcropping of the Industrial Revolution, and that Bismarck would be right around that time, like that would kind of fit. But I see within like the definition that we gave for fascism that like it basically started with Washington. and then into Hamilton and then moving on from that. Yeah, I mean, that does check out for sure. And, it is an ideology that I think required a charismatic leader of some kind. Mussolini, of course, being, was so wildly popular for a while in Italy. I mean, there's a reason he was able to do what he did. Of course, Hitler, being a similar scenario. I like your point about Teddy Roosevelt, and because under the definition that it's like this combination, that it's corporatism, like in one sense. There's a little bit more to it than that. But, for sure, like Teddy Roosevelt, granted, he was already dealing in U.S. politics in, the latter part of the 19th century during the Spanish-American War. And in that, like the Spanish-American War was completely about the sugar market. It had nothing to do with anything else. I mean, and it was, for its time, it was practically like a Vietnam as far as the way that it started. I mean, that's all real, like around 1898, like that's all very fascinating history. But, and again, like it was a total corporatist move. Like it really was just about the sugar market. So I like that. FDR, I would agree completely that was also fascist. And part of that comes from, I think, now there's more I could, I'm sure we're going to deep dive more into this. But some of the groups and the more prominent voices in America that were supportive of fascism were incredibly supportive of FDR. So I think that proves your point on that, Sec. Penguin, did you want to jump in with something?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just kind of share my framework that I've always kind of thought, at least it's ever since, I don't know, listening to a bunch of podcasts, kind of sure a couple congealed. So I'll just talk about certain figures, certain ideologies, certain movements that existed in the first half of it's really my idea of the first half of the 20th century. And that's obviously where fascism basically was like active, like fascism proper capital F, of course. And it was basically a time period. So, I mean, really, you can basically just roughly talk 1900 to 1945. Let's just say, or 50, whatever, guess whatever the cutoff is. I mean, certainly once World War II ends, you do reach a different era in history. But it just seems like with probably I suspect you could just lay it squarely at the feet of technology and the Industrial Revolution and everything. I think there was a presumption of, it seems like most people, certainly not all people, there were certainly, like, for example, anarchists existing. And the old right and certain other groups, this is certainly one unanimous, but I think there was an overall pretty broad consensus with, I mean, you have to look at the level of technological advancement in the latter half of the 19th century and the industrialization of Europe, of the United States, the rapid industrialization, the Gilded Age, just imagine living in that time and how much would have changed from your childhood to like your old age, just the level of wealth and access to all sorts of resources and technologies that just were not accessible, and then just tons of stuff that could not have existed. I mean, it was just a period of just very rapid advancement from like from the actual human perspective, not quantifiably measured in any way, but like it's an era of rapid advancement, and so ideas kind of advanced very similarly. But all that is to say that like it was a period of time in the first half of so probably the end of the the same time as Bismarck, and then into the progressive era, all the way up through World War II. I think there was a presumption. I think that the future was going to be totalitarian and collectivist, fully centralized government through the use of technology, but also necessitated by technology. The presumption was whether you were a right wing, left wing, liberal. I mean, the future, because of rapid technological advancement, the future would be one of totalitarian, fully centralized government. Not totalitarian necessarily in any kind of cruel way, but just a society fully governed by a massive bureaucratic state, a fully centralized state, one that has authority over all aspects of all people's lives, the economy, et cetera, culture, et cetera, et cetera. And, mass communication coming about at this time, the radio, and then onto the television and everything, like newspapers proliferating. It seems like whether you're talking about the communists or any liberals or anyone else. And so I do think that in the vein of, like, for example, like Zach mentioned, Bismarckian socialism, there's also a right wing, or supposedly right. I mean, there's a right wing counterpoint to the, sort of left socialist kind of fully centralized state apparatus, controlling an economy, kind of using Marx's idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, blah 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 blah. The counter, sort of a direct counterpoint to that, like a mirror image almost to that, would be the a fully centralized totalitarian state and fully state controlled, centrally planned political economy under a right wing, or so-called right wing guys, sort of in the tradition of, for example, going back to like Bismarckian socialism, which we have to understand, like, this is not just Prussian elite militarism and discipline. It was also like I had mentioned before, environmental regulation and workers regulation, workers' rights and stuff. Tremendous advances in all those things that are traditionally associated with like the left half of the politics, but it's like most places have that, even if they are more centrist or right leaning. So I think there was a presumption among most thinkers, except for obviously contrarian thinkers at this time, that technology would necessitate fully totalitarian government, and society would be dominated by a fully totalitarian and, I guess, essentially technocratic state.
Yeah. Wow, Penguin. Yeah. I love what you're saying about the technology. And that's kind of why, I always thought of fascism starting, with the industrial age, more particularly, because, so for example, the predominant at the time, let's say early 20th century. I think sex analysis that it actually goes further back. We can point back to the start of the U.S. There's certainly some value in that, and I want to touch back on that in a minute. But the two predominant, and people still think that they are the predominant political ideologies, are, of course, communism and capitalism. Right now, communism and capitalism actually have no real response, no answer, and really have no efficacy in a technologically advanced civilization. And when I say technologically advanced, I mean even something that has radio. And part of the reason that I say that, for example, like communism, okay, why didn't communism actually take over the world? Is it because Stalin just, became basically a dictator, or even a quasi-fascist, or not so quasi, or whatever? Certainly we could have a conversation around that. But the reason I think, and I'm not the first person to say this, but the reason I think that communism didn't take over is that communism could not, like Marx, could not imagine that the everyday person, the factory worker, whatever, would have access to ice cream. You know what I mean? Like, he could not imagine that, like, the niceties that the bourgeois had access to, and lots of these other things, even something as simple as ice cream. Like, he just couldn't imagine that the everyday person would have access to that. And 100%. That's what, right. And that's what quells, like this desire, for a communist utopia of some type, because no, suddenly you have healthcare, you have amazing food, you have housing, you got a nice car, you got all this stuff. So like, who cares, like, to that mind. Now, capitalism, of course, starts to eat itself very quickly, and it's been a slow decline, in my opinion, on it and now it's just speeding up. But regardless, is these two ideologies could not grasp really either not just what the quote unquote little people had access to, but also, the nouveau riche, the bourgeois, whatever you want to call the elites, even though we shouldn't really call them elites, because they're really parasites. Like, we shouldn't compliment them in any way. Regardless. So what happens is that you do get these technological developments, like say radio, and that's when a new ideology or a more formalized idea, a version, like you said earlier, Penguin, capital F, fascism, I think, comes to fore in America. So, like you really have to, okay, so what exactly, like what makes fascism like really come into power in Europe? Now, it's never just one thing. And for everything we're talking about here, like if anything listeners could understand, always understand that even if somebody talks like there's only one reason why these things happen, no, there's like a million, or however many, 23, whatever, but there's never just one. Anyway, one of the major drivers, of course, certainly within Germany, would be, the fall of the Weimar Republic. And this, would also be kind of mirrored in the United States with, the Great Depression in the 1930s. Okay. And so what happens out of, both of these economic declines is people are just fucking desperate, like what can we do? Like the system has failed, and it very much mirrors today, ironically, nearly 100 years later, like the system has failed. Fine, bring in a dictator. We don't care. Capitalism didn't work. Democracy didn't work. The XYZ didn't work. Like, then let's just have, a guy with orange skin sit in the chair, while he's puppeteered by somebody from South Africa, whatever. Okay. But like, I mean, it's really, this is a great conversation to have because I think it's very much mirroring a lot of what's going on today. And part of that is, again, it's a failure of, ideologies that have, like I said earlier, have no response to the technologically advanced civilization that we live in, and this is far more than radio. But regardless, so you have these, dramatic economic declines. People are just looking for an answer, looking for some kind of comfort. Honestly, in the 30s, technocracy could have very well happened then, but I think FDR's New Deal basically killed technocracy at the time. That doesn't mean it's gone away. It's still here. Sec, do you have something?
No, go for it.
Okay.
I'm listening.
Yeah, sure. So radio is something that allows for singular people, to have this, incredible reach, just like we have right now in what we're doing. And one of the major voices, in the US that was supportive of Hitler, or, well, I should say supportive of fascism. Okay. Let's just be a little more broad on that. Maybe they're a little more supportive of Mussolini than they were of Hitler per se, but that would be a priest who was a Catholic priest out of Michigan, of course, who would be known as the radio priest. I mean, he was that famous, like that he earned that title, the radio priest. And that was Charles Coughlin. Charles Coughlin was, and he's somebody who, he was very, anti-communism, also anti-capitalism, but was very pro-fascism. And I think that proves kind of Sec's point that fascism is sort of a third system. It's a third way in all of this, because again, he was one of the major voices that would push that. Charles Coughlin would end up, he would be very supportive of FDR. He would end up starting the Christian Front, which was an openly fascist organization, or fascist supportive organization in the United States. And they would have, some relationship with the German American Bund, which was also a pro-Nazi, would eventually, form into the American Nazi Party later on. Even though some of these organizations
who had rallies with Washington as the picture for their rally, by the way.
Yes. Well said. Good
Yep.
point.
Yep.
Great point. Yeah. So, even though like some of these, like the Christian Front would only last a couple of years, they would basically just change names, and still be going on. And this kind of leads to what I was saying earlier, that, okay, America may not have experienced like the hardcore implementation like Mussolini and Hitler did because of that, because they didn't see what that was actually like. I think that's why you had things like the Christian Front, why you had people like Charles Coughlin, the German American Bund, because sure, they're supporting it, but they don't really know what it's like, and you do see that, from people who would leave these organizations. They're like, yeah, oh yeah, I was supportive of it. Then I found out what it was about, and was like, fuck this, I'm out. Even Charles Coughlin he'd move away from his own organization, from the Christian Front, partially because of, racialist tendencies, from the actual Nazi Party. Penguin, you got something?
I mean, yeah, these kind of groups tend to eat their own, so it's not terribly surprising. That just kind of, that's just what I was thinking. I had another point, but if it comes back to me, I'll pipe up. Okay.
Yeah. So, like, we don't have to look hard. And these were in major cities like New York City and other places where, this support was had for fascism in America. I was curious. I was wondering where I wanted, even start all of this whole conversation. But the bottom line is that, yes, Americans have been supportive of fascism for an incredibly long period of time. And they weren't just supportive of it they're talking about it at the grocery store and, fascism, we should give that a shot. No, they were in the streets in support of, these fascist governments forming in Europe. We don't even have to get into, the eugenics movement, which 100% started. It did not start in Nazi Germany. That started in America as well. So a lot of these horrors that we think, happen in some far off land, a lot of them, the heart of it was actually, right in the United States. And these things, support or Penguin, go ahead if you got something.
Yeah. I mean, really, people will be surprised how much open support there was for both Hitler and Stalin. I mean, it was just normalized. So in late 1920s, I guess, early 30s, I think it would be pretty normal for people to consider Hitler not only a normal world leader. I mean, that's probably would be common, but actually to openly support Adolf Hitler, or not even support, but just say kind things about him. Like, look at this slick new guy that's
he was on the cover of Time magazine.
Yeah, that's the one. That's probably a lot where I get the idea from. It's not the only place. And Stalin, I mean, through the 40s and 30s, 40s, through the 50s. I mean, in some circles, for sure. I guess Stalin. His tendencies. I don't know how that all dies out. It does get subsumed, of course. I guess people move on to Mao worship, and inside the Soviet Union, of course, Stalin gets denounced secretly. But yeah, I mean, people absolutely. It was completely normal for newspapers and publications and people giving interviews to absolutely say plenty of kind things about Hitler or Stalin. Probably not both at the same time, but and maybe the periods of time sort of staggered from each other, even though they certainly coexisted as, I guess, the executives in their countries. But it's pretty shocking now to kind of go back and see that. I'm sure it's not played up, especially in the years immediately succeeding that time. It's probably played down quite a bit.
Yeah, and I don't think it was anything that ever really went away. Because I think a lot of people would say, oh yeah, well, fascism, and American support for fascism would basically, end with World War II. Now, granted, I mean, yes, we have the American Nazi Party that would operate for a very long time afterwards, but I think a lot of people would say that those were just outliers. But I think it's important to always take a look at the cultural zeitgeist. And often the cultural zeitgeist can be looked at, and maybe we'll talk about this a little more later too, can be looked at through the lens of entertainment. And now, this won't shock anybody who's listened to me on any platform, but I'm a huge Star Trek fan, classic Star Trek. And there was always an episode that bothered the fuck out of me when I was growing up. It was called, it's from the original series. It's the 21st episode of season 2. Aired back in February. I guess that would have been 1968. So, we're looking at almost 60 years ago. So keep that time frame in mind. And there's an episode called Patterns of Force. Now, I'm not going to give a regaling of the entire plot of the episode, but it's a weird episode, and if you go around the internet at all, you might see points where you'll suddenly see William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, who are both Jews, by the way, in real life, wearing Nazi uniforms, and it's like, wait, what the hell is that? Like that. That's weird. And it actually all comes from this episode where they go to this planet called Ecos. It's actually it's a star system. It has 2 planets, Ecos and another one named Xeon. That name makes sense after you watch the episode a little bit more. And the Enterprise is going there to find out because there's this Federation like cultural historian who they haven't heard from anymore, who said he was in trouble, something like that. And so they show up at this planet and they're trying to figure out what's going on. And when they get there, a rocket gets launched at the Enterprise. And they're like, wait a minute, we know the Ecosians, they don't have this technology. How the hell did this happen? And they go down to the planet, and what do they find? Nazis everywhere. Like, I mean, and they look just like, Earth Nazis, swastikas, the whole thing, goose stepping, the whole business. And to make a long story short, what you basically find out is that the Federation historian lands on this planet, Ecos, and the people there are just like these warlike anarchists because, anarchists are never peaceful, right? Of course, that's a terrible, terrible joke. But anyway, and to try and bring order to this planet that like the people are just destroying themselves, this Federation cultural envoy basically says, well, what was the most efficient? And this is what he says. What was the most efficient system of government that humanity had ever devised? And his claim was Nazi Germany. That was the most efficient. Now, how the fuck did that get on NBC in 1968? I don't know. How did they get away with making that kind of claim, that kind of statement, that Nazism is the most efficient form of government in history? Now, I understand, like, the point that's being made with this. Is it why would they say that Nazism is like the most efficient? Well, one could argue, and of course, today we paradoxically and questionably benefit, shall we say, from the knowledge, medical knowledge, technological knowledge that we basically integrated, into the United States from what the Nazi, from Nazi scientists, what they had learned, and Nazi doctors and so on. And it's basically because they had no rules. They'd sacrifice anybody and everybody. They'd throw their own pilots to see what exactly, a human could handle in an airplane or in a jet or whatever technologies they happen to be using, like how many G-forces could they really handle, or what temperature extremes could they handle? And people would die in these experiments, and it wasn't like just Jews getting tossed in. It was their own soldiers, their own military service people that they were using in these experiments and so on. And there was just absolutely no care for the consequences. There's no care for human life. So when the statement gets made on Star Trek, of all things, this incredibly progressive show, right? Humanity has ever devised. I can only assume that that's exactly what they meant by that. And what ends up happening is, you basically, like, they don't even decry in the episode. They don't even decry that, well, Nazism always fails. What they decry is that, well, one bad apple ended up taking over, and I guess that would be their, what they would equate to Hitler or something. And that's what ruined everything. But if it just stayed to the Nazi ideals or to the fascist ideals, that actually the Ecosians would be doing incredibly well, because clearly they had already advanced to the point that they could even shoot, weapons at the USS Enterprise in outer space. It's an incredibly strange episode, but it's hard not to walk away from it with the message that at the time in Hollywood, you had writers who were basically pro-fascist. And, had no problem making that kind of statement. Now, I'm not saying that Star Trek pushes that narrative necessarily, because, of course, one of the most important things to understand about entertainment in general, or about television series, is 9 times out of 10, a television series goes through so many different writers, and every writer has different ideals and different ideas. So, like, to say that a show, this show is promoting this agenda and that agenda or whatever, if they have the same writing team consistently throughout the show, okay, maybe. But at least over the past, up until recently, most television shows had different writers all across the board. And so Star Trek is wildly inconsistent in its ideologies as any. But the point being that, yeah, the message that, fascism is the most efficient is not new to American audiences. And even in 1968 was being promoted positively. Sec, what do you got?
I think I actually agree with that message. It's like you said, you'd be surprised how efficient you can be if you just don't value human life at all.
Oh yeah, get rid of ethics and you can do whatever you want. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like, like you said, I think you said it on another episode we did where it's like, well, we don't have enough energy. Well, let's just kill 20,000 people. It's very efficient. And I think many people have made this argument, but I think that Nazi Germany and the fascists, they were sort of the height of, rationalism and efficiency. And it's if you strive for in service of the nation state, but if you strive for those goals, yeah, you can get a lot of shit done. But like I said, if you don't value human life, there's going to be a lot of suffering along the way. But you're getting a whole lot of work done. Yeah. I want to go back to something you guys said that made me think, and I'm drawing on Michel Foucault and others here, but you guys kept pointing to technology and the Industrial Revolution, and this sort of plays into the efficiency and of the fascists and whatnot. But in some sense, fascism is trying to recreate society into a factory, like worker discipline, sort of a martial culture, something everyone's working towards the same goal, a homogeneity, in service of the goals of the nation state. And it may be the case that these sort of ideas existed prior, like I mentioned with George Washington and Hamilton and others. But the training of the factory floor during the Industrial Revolution is what allowed allowed countries around the world to start achieving it. Because you got to understand how people were before factories. You got up when the sun rose, you ate breakfast when you were hungry, you got your farm chores done, maybe you puffed on your pipe for a while, you did things according to your own schedule, and nature and everything was very sort of individualized according to your wants and needs and the needs of your family. Well, the factory, all of a sudden you're on somebody else's time. So you need regimentation. You had immigrants coming over. I think this was mostly from Italy, who had never seen a clock before. They didn't know what a clock was. And that's not because they were stupid. It's because they didn't need to keep track of time. They did things according to the schedule, whatever schedule they wanted. They didn't have to know what time it was. They just kind of looked at the sun and said, okay, I got a couple hours of daylight left. I'm going to do this. So you had to train a whole group of people, mostly immigrants, and stuff them in these factories to allow them to be very regimented and orderly, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think this sort of trained a whole generation of people that, a generation or two later now would be very accepting of fascism and all of these and just national. This is the era of nationalism, right? Bismarck and Prussia and all this, Poland, everything else. This is the era. France wasn't even a country before then. This is when Germany became a country. So this is right around the era of nationalism as well. So you had trained a whole generation of people to be very regimented in these factory floors, and essentially all of the societies around the world became like factories in some weird way. And that really, the fascism is just the pinnacle of that. It's sort of reorganizing society in the same way that you would organize a factory floor. So everyone is working as a cog towards the same goal. And you saw that in America just the same as you saw it everywhere else. And now I forgot where I was going with the rest of that. But it's fascism in a weird way is efficiency above all, how do we achieve this goal? Sort of a utilitarian thing. How do we achieve this goal with no regard for human life? Everyone was in service of the nation state's goals, and that was all there is to it.
Yeah, I'll say of all my time on the internets from a probably inappropriate young age, but this is actually a lot more recent. I have really I'm really encountering having a decent amount of exposure to really only two people I would say were generally fascist, generally fascistic. No, not generally fascistic. I'm sorry. They were generally fascists. And they actually were fascists. They were like self-described fascists or national socialists or whatever. And really, one thing that really struck me is to hear these guys like talk. I mean, one wasn't like a deranged Telegram channel, and one is like a public figure on a social media platform. So I got, in that little bit of exposure, what struck me is how far apart they are from, we were talking about how fascism is a third way, how far apart they are from the American right, how very little in common they have with the American right. They don't come off as an agreement with the American right at all. That they will, like, for example, on something like, for example, the free speech issue, which I know that's gone back and forth, but just in an issue like the vaccine mandates or, kind of lockdowns or whatever like that, like it's just a lot of things. The right to bear arms, for example. I mean, they clearly don't necessarily want everybody to equally be able to bear arms, even if they think it's, practically not something they want to see go away. But, and the list goes on and on and on. But the idea is like, even, that they would often take a position that's very, I don't know, centrist or left coded in at least today's politics, or a very, progressive or, kind of big government position. Certainly a position, and there's plenty of people out there kind of like that are not left leaning, that have a very, sort of, we need a more effective state sort of ideology, but actually have that and have it be so very like, ethnocentric and nationalist and so on and so forth, but have it missing such key, like, fundamental characteristics that are associated with the American right. It is kind of a jarring, it's kind of a jarring view, it'd be just to have, like, it really, that's why I do think that it is the quote unquote right wing side of the totalitarian coin. And there were plenty of ideologies out there. There were plenty of thinkers that were putting forth ideas. And like I said, what I already gathered from, I think it's just a couple of podcasts that really made this click in my head about talking about thinkers from the 20s and 30s, is that, where a lot of people went ideologically in that period, it was just the presumption, regardless of where they started. They might have been very leading into another direction. They might have been individualists. They might have been whatever. They might have been liberals. But the presumption was that you were going to have totalitarian, perhaps world government. A lot of this actually, the baseline of this is basically like, look what, what's his name? George Orwell wrote about, and how he imagined the world would be in 1984, writing in 1944, I think, or whatever, in the 1940s. I mean, I do think most people thought there would be like one or two, or maybe three in this case, massive states that are completely totalitarian. I mean, it's just basically the world of 1984 is described, not just the world that's described. I remember very clearly, even though I didn't really do my assigned reading in that, in that class, but like, I remember the world that was envisioned. I mean, these were three massively totalitarian, just brutally totalitarian states that had control over all communication and all social interaction and every aspect of every part of the economy. And I mean, that's just, I mean, it went with the technology, the view screens, and the mass media that was portrayed in there. It just was, I mean, that's just where people thought human civilization was going. And, you clearly have the egalitarian, socialist, Marxist, on and on and on down the line model of, a workers' party led state that was fully centralized. And like I said, you have a very different vision with the various branches of fascism and National Socialism and stuff like that. I mean, the idea, like, we might argue over the Nazis really right wing or really left wing. They have socialists. Well, because why did socialism wasn't even considered like lefty in the sense that socialism was the presumed future. Essentially, the liberals, classical liberalism they basically tried to cut off the neck of classical liberalism. That's where they actually sat down. Apparently, all the liberals got together, sat down, and agreed that liberalism wasn't going to be like, I don't even remember exactly what it is, and I can't remember the name of the event. But like all the world's preeminent liberal intellectuals got together and said, well, I guess liberalism is going to be not free market anymore, and the people that we didn't go along with that going forward were the classical liberals, which is a term I've always hated. But the presumption is you were going to have massive bureaucratic technocratic states.
Yeah, I blame the Catholics.
Go on.
I'm not the kind to like blame them for everything. Yeah, right. I'm not the kind to like.
Are you guys?
Yeah, right. I'm not the kind to blame them for like everything, but oh boy, do we always find their heads popping up in all of these things. So, I mean, I love what Sek was saying about, actually, this all started with George Washington, or like this goes that far back. I know we've talked about this book before on Into the Void, and I really I cannot recommend this book enough. Like, this is just a must read. And it's The Secret Founding of America by Nicholas Haggard. And in that, his premise is that when America was quote unquote founded, or at least when it was starting to get explored, Jamestown and even beyond that, there were three groups that were really fighting for control of North America. And that was the Freemasons, the Puritans or Protestants, and Catholicism. Those were the three major groups that were really combating with each other. And Nick Haggard would argue that went on for quite some time. And I would agree with that sentiment. And I'd also agree with the sentiment that actually, like, Catholicism never really gave up that war. And perhaps now, connecting, say, Catholicism with the Society of Cincinnati is a little bit tenuous, so I don't necessarily want to go into that. I mean, there's an argument that could be made that people who live within the geographic area known as the United States of America are fortunate that George Washington did not, take the kingship. Maybe actually we'd be more fortunate if we didn't get rid of the actual King George, but that's a separate conversation. Sek, what do you got?
He didn't take the kingship because there were people threatening a second revolution.
Yeah.
So It wasn't, people present that like, oh, they wanted him to be king, but he just refused to be king because he's so noble. No, the anti-federalists were ready to cut federals' throats and start a new revolution against the federalists right then and there. So he thought that he would appease the anti-federalists by stepping down.
Right.
That was right. Sorry, I had to jump that in, but
no, 100%. And because, a lot of people are going to point out, well, wait a minute, but wasn't George Washington a Freemason? That's a whole other interesting, I mean, yes, we know the painting, we know all that stuff. But that's a very, interesting conversation to have. But regardless, that presence was very much in America. Now, the biggest example of somebody who in America who had, because he was the radio priest that was, had such incredible influence, created entire organizations, within the United States to support fascist regimes, was Charles Coughlin, who, was getting support for most of his run, by the archdiocese, like his speeches had to run through them and everything. So, I mean, he was getting approval from, the Catholic hierarchy, to put it simply, to continue to support fascism. And look, I mean, people can revise history however they want to, but we have, I think we have very strong evidence that, Pope Gregory was being very supportive of Hitler as well as Mussolini.
Yeah, I mean, but at the same, like, it's kind of like what I'm mentioning, like, obviously Marxist oriented, left-wing socialist totalitarianism was completely atheist in its worldview. And, I mean, notably National Socialism, I think being one of the most far out prominent iteration of fascism, it was close to, it wasn't actually, it was close to atheist. It leaned heavily on folk ideas, but in general, if you're looking at some of the more, I don't know, grounded in earlier fascist kind of movements, so basically like Franco, Mussolini, and probably some others that I'm not as familiar with, they're very aligned with like protecting the church as an institution, as opposed to the very, very militantly atheist, often, left-wing revolutionaries active in the same place, and they both would exist, and liberals and others, of course, at the same time, because it was a very just tenuous time of like very mixed ideologies all over the place, which is kind of crazy in our context. Like, you really just don't see strong ideological movements and having multiple, 3 or more, sort of with soldiers armed with at least clubs and knives, if not a lot more, active in gangs in the street. And I think it was probably pretty common in the 20s and 30s in different parts of the world, especially in Europe, but probably elsewhere too. But anyways, and kind of this thing, like, sort of protecting the institution of the church, especially in Catholic countries, against, it really is the right wing, the pro-religion, I don't know if you would say pro-family, but pro-religion, pro-tradition element, where I guess centering sort of the anti-Bolshevism. It's not that they necessarily were a opposite of Bolshevism, like we are radically free market liberal and decentralization and stuff like that. It's that they want to protect that. They want to protect people's church and people's sort of culture and identity and the traditional, a counter reaction to Bolshevism and the like. But at the same time,
the church repaid them by sneaking out a bunch of Nazis through Franco Spain, and hiding Nazis, by the way.
That's probably and of course the church I'm sure the church would have had no problem working with. The Nazis. I don't know how close the alignment was with Nazis, but Mussolini and especially Franco, I think Franco was very much a defender of the church and everything, and it's so pronounced in these Catholic countries, because I guess the church really was an institution. It was an absolute institution in a way that probably you just can't mirror as closely in Protestant countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's to understand, like, Catholicism understands, say, the second coming of Christ, like, in a very different way than most Christians do. But I don't think Christians really realize that, right? Because you have like 3 different ideas of how the end times are supposed to be. Now, trust me, this is important and it's relevant. You have like post-millennialism, pre-millennialism. Basically, you have this idea that there's this 1,000 years that's supposed to occur, and there's a tribulation that's supposed to happen. When you think that tribulation is supposed to happen is a completely different story. But, this is all supposed to happen upon the second coming. And then there's this 1,000 years of peace or whatever, or 1,000 years. And then, everybody comes back to earth on New Jerusalem, blah, blah, blah. We don't need to go into all of that. My point to make is that the Catholic Church is what they call amillennialist, meaning that they think that we're basically already there. Like, ever since Christ came and the church was founded, that the church is in charge. The church is Christ on earth, and that they are meant to call the shots here. Okay. Not saying that there isn't going to be some actual second coming of Christ. They do still kind of believe in that sort of thing, but that the world exists right now, even though it's not a literal 1,000-year period for them, but that the world exists right now in a state where the church is perfecting everything to get to the point where, life on earth would be a New Jerusalem. Okay. Another great book that, again, to recommend, and I know I've mentioned this one many times as well, is The Hiram Key Revisited by Charles Alan Butler and Charles Knight. That kind of goes into some of this anyway. But the point being is that the church, the Catholic Church, really does think that, like, it is supposed to, be in charge of things and ordering things around. I mean, this is the very nature of the Holy Roman Empire and, its history. It becomes a question, like, some people say, well, the Holy Roman Empire ended, 200 years ago or something like that. Okay, well, did it really? Because there's I see regularly, even just over the past 200 years, I regularly see instances where the Catholic Church is instigating destabilization of varying countries, including the United States. For example, even during the American Civil War, the only quote unquote country that actually recognized the South, that had recognized the Confederacy as an actual country, as a separate country, was the Vatican itself. They're incredibly supportive of it. Now, of course, at the time, like you look at the North, and I mean, Catholics were not treated very well up North, which was an interesting contradistinction, to of course how the South was, the claims were that of how they were treating blacks. So it's also not uninteresting that today, we're talking about, in the 2020s, or really since 2016, we're talking about this new rise of fascism, and who is, what religion is the president in charge right now? And he's a Catholic. And so it's just, there's this underlying, it's almost like this, it's like the political version of cosmic background radiation. And Catholicism is always there. Now, I'm not going to come out and say, oh, all the Catholics are bad or something like this, whatever. But the church as an institution finds itself at the heart and spreading the message even of this ideology that we call fascism. And, it becomes a question of, well, what's going on there? Why is this? Why is that always there? And do I have the answer to that? No, not exactly. Other than I would stand by the statement that, the world does not actually, operate under governments. It operates under secret societies. And the Catholic Church, not Catholics necessarily, but the Catholic Church is, the most open secret society that we have. But Sek, what do you got?
Well, I think this would be a good point to introduce the Rerum Novarum. And remind me, Brian, was that Leo the 13th?
Sounds about right.
So I think it's Pope Leo the 13th. He wrote the Rerum Novarum. And many people have pointed to this as sort of the first theoretical work, and it's not a religious text. It's a social political text.
Right.
To the degree that you could see this in a university. It's the real deal. And people have pointed to this as the first theoretical text for the political economy known as corporatism.
Yes.
So essentially it's again class collaborationist. It's the capitalists need to be nice to the workers need to be taken care of, everybody needs to be on the same page. It's a huge text. Everyone should go read it. And this came from Go ahead. Real quick.
Yeah, it fits in with the timeline of Bismarck, like you said, because we're talking like late 19th century when this was it's a papal encyclical. So yeah, that this gets espoused. Anyway, go ahead.
So I forgot where I was going with that.
Sorry.
So essentially, this is for many is the basis for corporatism, and the idea that both capitalists and workers should be, working not for their own petty individual goals, but for some higher goal. And he lays out the way the whole society should run, and it's not dissimilar from what would later become like the fascist political economy. It's 100%. Very, very similar. And it's not dissimilar from what happened in the US at the same time. So I think you're onto something with the Catholics, in the sense that they also have the more radical Catholics, who I would not put in this what do you call that, liberation theology, and that I wouldn't put them in the same camp. They're more, I guess, Marxist leaning, if you would, I guess. But for a lot of Catholics, I think this fits very well in sort of the tradition. And the reason a lot of the fascist and even like classical conservatives were what I would say is anti-capitalist is because they believed capitalism sort of degrades society and the family and community and the church and all these sorts of things, and it promotes degeneracy and all this kind of stuff. And the conservatives back in the day were against capitalism for this reason. They were more, I would say, aristocratic. But I think it's a lot of traditional Catholics are anti-capitalist and sort of third position, or at least I'll say the Catholic Church then, but for the same reason. And that's why you see even now a lot on the right who are in some way anti-capitalist and pro-state intervention, because they believe it's degrading society or degrading community or high virtues or families, and there is some truth to that. A lot of the way our system is run now does sort of degrade community and people, and sort of puts everybody in their own individual little box where they don't really have any support structures. And I agree with some of that, but I don't agree with the way things are going to sort of combat that.
I'm glad you added that last part. I like that. That really just ties into exactly. I don't mean to cut you off, man, but like I'm glad you added that last part, because like that's kind of what I like. I don't obviously listen to fascist publications from the heyday of fascism, but like I listen to a very fairly statist podcast. I guess you'd call them almost like the socially conservative, fiscally liberal side of politics, which is massively underrated as a thing, even as existing. But sort of, I think you can certainly steelman more modern right wing ideas, and sometimes they're very moderate in the terms of like how zealously right wing they are, but like often sort of collaborating with people more in the center or the left. But like, yeah, I mean, there's certainly an idea not only that capitalism leads, or capitalism and liberal capitalism leads to like degeneracy and the breakdown of like religion and family in a very simplistic sense, but that it actually, I mean, they are right that it does break down families, communities, social life. Like I get where they're coming from. We can certainly agree with still being pro-market, especially I consider myself very pro-market, but like I can certainly see where they come from. And frankly, like I can sort of see these people, like they have their, not only might they make a good point, but like more importantly, like they seem a lot more grounded than the sort of pro big business, pro corporate right, the regular Republican establishment conservatives that often seem to have a very anti-human, anti-community idea. And it's because they actually, I mean, I've seen this explained on Twitter, pretty concisely that it's a completely different sort of fundamental understanding of the world. People that sort of enjoy suburban subdivisions and pickup trucks and football and artificial foods and they eat plenty of foods with artificial sweeteners and all sorts of additives, and the people that sort of are kind of starting to supplant them on the right, and also this whole dichotomy existing on the left too, in a different form. The kind of people that want to eat more natural and be more involved with their community and the church and everything, and that have certainly don't think that you should have that are less likely to be pro market and more likely to be sort of pro community, pro church, and pro like. And I get it. Like sometimes these people seem a lot less anti-human than the old school style right wingers. And like I said, the economy is just on the left too. There's more natural, crunchy left wingers, and there's sort of like, let's go all the way, pump you full of chemicals, artificial this, embryos, sex change, everything. And it's like, well, I mean, these are real dichotomies. I don't think that's the best argument I've ever seen, that there really isn't a real left-right divide. It's more complicated.
Yeah, in some sense, I agree that the modern society has traded like real connection and meaning and community for just like vapid consumerism and materialism. I don't disagree with that. But then you get the answer to a lot of these somewhat we'll call them populist types now, is like, well, that means we need to have the state incentivize having children and community and whatever the thing. And I don't agree with that solution. Obviously, the solution for me is we just build these things ourselves, but
it hasn't seemed to work anyway.
No, of course not. The state never does. I think I interrupted you earlier, Brian. What you were saying with the Rerum Novarum? Were you finished before?
Oh, yeah. No, I was. But I do want to, that was such a brilliant thing to bring up, Sec, because that in a very real, earlier I even compared fascism to corporatism, they're sort of like, it's not even the other side of the coin. It's like a two-headed quarter. It's right. They're the same thing. And so that was a brilliant thing to bring up. I really, really recommend anybody listening to this, look into Charles Coughlin, because another important point. And I know we have this lined up for some episode in the future, and we'll get into that more then. But in 2016, when a lot of the libertarians and anarcho-capitalists, basically became pro-Trump and basically got involved in politics out of nowhere, when that happened, I actually wasn't surprised. I wasn't surprised at all. And part of the reason that I wasn't surprised is characters like Charles Coughlin actually espouse a lot of the ideas that anarcho-capitalists espouse or that libertarians espouse, even like Ron Paul. Charles Coughlin was, again, we're talking about, this guy was incredibly pro-fascist. He was also anti-communist. He was, what he would say in his own words, he was anti-modern capitalism, right? Which maybe that's what like Ron Paul would say is crony capitalism or something like that. Okay, maybe. But he was very much about like, okay, you got to end the Fed. Like he was saying that, 80 years before any libertarian was. He had the concept of like the money changers. He was wanting, no, we got to switch to silver away from gold. Lots of all kinds of ideas. I'm just touching, the tip of the iceberg with this stuff, of where he was actually very much in line with a lot of libertarian thought. But he was pro-fascist. And so, to me, now, I've brought this up before, even on our little series here. I've brought it up before. I've brought it up on my own show in the past. Like, I don't understand, why are so many people in the Mises Institute Catholic? Like, I don't get it. And again, I'm not making some like broad swath against Catholics. The papacy I could talk about all day and rip really, really hard on it, and with a lot of evidence. But regardless, I never really understood it. But once suddenly you have Trump coming into power, and again, depending upon how one experiences it, I would agree. I think he's a fascist. And certainly the guy who's actually in charge, that being Elon Musk, is 1,000% a fascist. It fits in with the early American supporters of fascism, of their ideas of what they wanted, like the ideology. It's a hop, skip, and a jump. And so it didn't surprise me that so many of these people, so many libertarians and anarcho-capitalists suddenly became pro-Trump. And it doesn't surprise me also that they didn't realize, just like at certain points, Charles Coughlin didn't realize, oh, what's the end game of this? Oh shit. It's not just killing Jews. It's a whole lot more. Sec, what do you got? Or Penguin?
Yeah, I haven't looked completely into this. I actually need to look into this further, but I've seen definitely like evidence that's probably pretty obvious if you've delved into this. That for example, like Mussolini and other fascists, and understandably so, as compared to when the enemy on the horizon is Bolshevism, and who were driven by Marxist-Leninist ideology. They were fairly pro market or pro-libertarian to an extent, in surprising ways that sort of belie the whole like the state first. Cause I guess we think of the Nazi Germany in the middle of World War II, war socialist economy, but that they were actually pretty in the when like the remotely what the nature of political economy is going to be like. It was actually an active debate in 1920. Like they were relatively like pro market as compared to a lot of other people at the time.
Sure.
So you're correct, but like not for the reasons people think. It's not that they were like ideologically pro property or pro market. It's just everything came down to what is best for the nation state, what works best, what is the most efficient for the goals of the nation state. And if that meant, privatizing certain things and nationalizing others and whatever they thought was the best at the time, that's what they were going to do. And so that did, for some certain industries, that meant, they did privatize things, and then Hitler would bring all the owners of these businesses into a room and basically you're going to do what we say, we're going to shoot you in the head and find somebody else who will. So
that exists now. I mean,
yes, that's how things work now. Yes.
But Congress can bring in the CEO of any company that they want in there and put them on the TV and have a struggle session with them. The president can meet with the CEO of anybody and maybe play the good cop. There's different flavors of this, but like, yeah. I mean, this certainly exists. I think it exists in a more palatable and streamlined way. Than maybe something.
Well, it's like Robert Higgs said. He says, "Well, the U.S. it's a nicer participatory fascism." I love that line. Yeah. Hey, I got like 10 minutes left.
Oh, okay.
Maybe 15, but like 10 would be good. Is there anything else we want to wrap on this, or do we want to touch on and do a little teaser of post World War II fascism?
Let's go for it. I don't have anything else to say about that. But I am seeing how this is a kind of a distinct topic for sure.
Yeah.
Brian, did you have anything to add to, I guess we'll say fascism pre-1946, but
no, that's it. My recommendation to people, look into Charles Coughlin. You're in for quite the ride. That's it.
Right on. So the great George Carlin, and it's a famous quote, he says, the Germans lost World War II. Fascism won it. So already towards the end of World War II, and for somewhat obvious reasons, the U.S. was, well, let's go back. During World War II, there's a lot of people that were surprised that FDR, including a lot of the fascists, sided with the communists against the fascists. And I think it's for the reasons I stated before. It had more to do with the fascists screwing up international trade for the U.S. and Britain than anything else.
Yeah, it was less a given. It was less a given that was going to happen. I mean, at the time, we look at it back in the past, and it's like it's so obvious. And I guess the side switched somehow. And that's a little question mark there. But like, yeah, I mean, it could have gone the other way around. The U.S. could have supposedly had a fascist in charge, but I don't know if Smedley Butler was telling the truth, because I think the guy in charge wasn't that. I mean, I have no idea. Well, right. I don't know. There still could have been a fascist takeover of the U.S., or people could have just voted for it. Honestly, but like I said, in terms of whether we were going to have a much bigger government, I think that was a given, no matter who. But it wasn't a given that the U.S. was going to be on one side of that conflict or the other. I
mean, the U.S. had forced sterilization and eugenics, just like Brian mentioned earlier, and race law and all that sorts of thing. It was completely in line with fascist Europe, and there was a lot of people in the U.S. and in Europe that assumed that the U.S. was going to side with the fascists against the communists, but they didn't, and they sided with the communists, and obviously they wanted to bail out Britain. So I think some of that had to do with FDR's ties with. And J.P. Morgan's ties with people in the UK, but so they sided with that side, the Allies, with what we call the Allies, and then before the war had even ended, they realized that the communists were going to be a problem, because they had just handed half of Europe to Stalin. So as soon as the war ended, they began rearming fascists and former Nazis all over the world. And they brought a lot of them over, as you know, Operation Paperclip, and they became NASA, and then also in NATO. There's some names for some of these programs. They also funded the mob in Italy and former fascists in Italy because after World War II and the fall of Mussolini, the Communist Party became really popular in Italy. So they were worried about, Italy becoming communist and what have you. And they're working with the mob and former fascists in Italy and all over the world, in the Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, stay behind networks inside of Russia. Even there was fascists inside of Russia they were trying to fund. Obviously, right-wing death squads all over South America later on. I think they stopped funding Ukrainian Nazis in like the late 60s, but maybe mid 60s. But right afterwards, they picked up they just immediately switched sides. It's like, well, okay, that one's done. Now we fund the Nazis against the communists. And there's a lot of generals that said we fought for the same side, or fought for the wrong side in the U.S. military. And I have no love for the Soviet Union. They're horrible. It was a horrible place to live in. But it's not strange to me at all that the U.S. just immediately, switched sides to the fascist after World War II. And I think the particular brand of like what I would call international fascism actually won World War II. And in 1991, they defeated the only other power that rivaled their own. It's sort of the same way that it's not dissimilar from the U.S. like funding the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets, and all through the 90s, by the way, funding Islamic radicals. They
even sent Rambo over there. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Rambo 3 there. The Mujahideen, and then various, I think the Islam group and various other ones all throughout the 90s, and so in Serbia, and, Algeria, and Bosnia, and then obviously 9/11 happens, and they switch sides and start going after Sunni extremists, and then that lasts for about 6 years maybe, and then they started. It's the redirection by Seymour Hersh, and then they just switched back to arming and funding the Sunni extremists all over the world, while also bombing them in other areas if they get out of line. And I don't know where I was going with that, but it's the same situation. Like they were fascists, they sided with the fascists. Then World War II happens, they defeated the fascists, and then they just go right back to arming them again. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so, the way I see it, I guess I don't know. The way I like to look at these things is let's just, for lack of a better term, it's not exactly what I'm doing, but for lack of a better term, like let's steelman the U.S. siding with fascists after World War II. No, but I mean, really, you gotta maybe look at their perspective. Like it's I look at the period leading up to World War II as a tripartite thing. Where it was there was liberal countries, there was fascist countries, and there was communist countries, and obviously the liberals were a lot less totalitarian than the other ideologies, but they were obviously more so than we now deem as classical liberals, old school liberals. And like I said, this was done, and officially this was on paper. But anyways, so it could have, like we mentioned, it could have gone either way. And I think after obviously the Axis powers were destroyed and the communists were, I mean, yes, these countries were decimated. Well, the Soviet Union was decimated, and they were already obviously rebuilding, and they now had control sort of over a large portion of Eastern and Central Europe, and a large influence, and they solidified their influence over other. They were starting to solidify their influence over other parts of the world. That, I mean, it kind of makes sense. Like there was not exactly a pool of like militantly liberal people all over the world to fight the communists that were, naturally, but also with the assistance of the Soviet Union and over the international communist organizations led by the Soviet Union, because that's what they did. They believed in sort of spreading communism, even though they weren't full on like world revolution. But like, I mean, and also communism didn't, organically, like Marxism, communism naturally and organically took hold all over the world, and a lot of like anti-colonial resistance movements were explicitly Marxist oriented. Probably a majority of them, I would say, at least in this period of time. No citation for that, but I would suspect that would be true or close to it. So I guess, fascists and fascist-like people, and there was sort of a global network of fascism. I mean, fascism was global, like Nazi fascism. I mean, there was, and the other European powers and the other minor parts of the Axis. I mean, they had an ideology that they could copy and paste and have like affiliates in any part of the world and places that were currently colonized and didn't have their actual de jure independence. So I guess it sort of made sense. And then even if people weren't like, these people weren't historically associated with Nazi Germany or anything at the time. It was like, these right-wing dictators. I mean, if you get somebody who looks like Franco, but in another place in the world, that's basically supporting someone that's like a Franco in South America or Southeast Asia or whatever. Not necessarily saying that these people got their cues from Mussolini or Franco or Hitler or anyone anywhere else, but that's who's available to fight the commies. And you can kind of see why they led in this direction. And if everything had gone the other direction, the U.S. had sided with the fascists in World War II, defeated the communists, then the whole opposite situation probably could have happened due to balance of power. I mean, I have no idea. That's purely hypothetical. But that's how it seems to me. Like the situation kind of lends itself to that. Any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah. Well, we should wrap it here, and we'll start next time starting with World War II, moving on to the post-war era up till today. But I will say this: I think Germany and Russia had almost fought to a stalemate in Europe, and I think if the U.S. hadn't joined the war, it's possible that they would have sort of fought to a stalemate and sued for peace. Instead, we came in on the side of the communists, which took the pressure off and allowed Stalin to take half of Europe, So I think if we'd allowed two very terrible people to just fight to a stalemate, it might. I think it's possible that both of their societies might have collapsed, and they wouldn't have been like the USSR was. Germany was pretty decimated, but the USSR was pretty decimated too. They had a lot of demographic issues and whatnot, and I think that's why they had to expand. But
well, there's also Lend-Lease.
Yes, yeah, we propped them up during and after the war. So it's possible that communism and fascism might have both collapsed if the U.S. hadn't come in on and gave one side an overwhelming victory. But that's a counterfactual you can't really prove. But I don't think it's that far off. But we should end it there though, because I gotta put the little one to bed here soon. But we should. You guys down for starting next round? Next episode we'll do essentially World War II, and then moving into Gladio, NATO, and sort of stay behind networks, and also, NASA and Operation Paperclip. You guys down for that?
Yeah, 100%. My last statement here is I don't even like using the word believe. I firmly stand that the Nazis, they never lost World War II. They just changed their seat of power from Berlin to Washington, D.C.
Yes.
and
Argentina.
Yeah. Right. And South America, a good chunk of that for sure.
And possibly Antarctica.
Yep.
Yeah. And the moon.
There, Penguin. There you go.
And the moon.
That's right. We're space Nazis. We're going to go there. But I mean, because the last
everybody watched the documentary Iron Sky. It's great.
Yeah, right. Yeah, watch both of them. But,
possibly soon to be Mars.
Yeah. Right. Oh, they went there in '69. What are you talking about, man? Anyway, but like we talked about earlier with that episode of Star Trek where they made the claim that Nazism was the most efficient form of government. If today in the United States, if you don't think that like everything, corporate government, everything is about moving towards more and more efficiency, what is that a sign of? I think that's absolutely a sign of fascism and a sign of, that Nazism is still very much alive and well. So I guess we're going to pay off that tease next time.
Yeah. That'll be a part 2. Brian, let everybody know what you've been doing a bunch of changes at your your podcast. You want to plug a little stuff? Tell them what you're doing.
Yeah, sure. So you can have fun typing in this URL, and it might save some marriages, because when you start typing in XXX, you can actually just say, "Oh no, I'm just going to my favorite podcast," that being xxtech.net. So just don't type in the letter A and then Asian ass porn shows up, and you don't need that. But xxtech.net, that's where you can find everything that's going on. And actually, this weekend I got some really exciting stuff launching. Well, by the time this episode's out, all that stuff will already have launched, and I'm just super excited for people to see it. All kinds of cool things going on, but YouTube channel, all of it, and just go to xxtech.net and you can get your hookup.
Does that send you everywhere for all your YouTube and your Spotify, everything?
Yeah, it takes you to a Linktree page that has links to everything, because there's just so much going on, and so much of it is, man, like if you're a conservative, oh boy, are you going to be in trouble, and I'm going to convert you, but that's all right.
Right on. Well, thanks, brother. This was a blast as always. Yes. I will right after we get off of this, we'll hammer out a date for part 2, and everybody be excellent to each other, and we'll see y'all next time.
Peace.
Ciao.
Peace.